Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Dr. Diane Sanchez, and we're going to discuss performance management and the appraisal. Our learning objectives is to identify why performance management is necessary, distinguish among three types of performance information, explain the differences between administrative and developmental uses of performance appraisal, describe the advantages and disadvantages of multi-source 360 appraisal, discuss the importance of training managers and employees about performance appraisal and give examples of rater errors, and identify several concerns about appraisal feedback and ways to make it more effective. Okay, so what's the difference between performance management versus performance appraisal? They're very two specific things, and sometimes I think employees as well as management make it interchangeable. The performance management is a series of activities designed to ensure that the organization gets the performance it needs from its employees. The performance appraisal is the process of determining how well employees do in their jobs relative to a standard and communicating that information to them. Here is the nature of the performance management process. First of all, you've got to make it clear what the organization expects, provide performance information to employees, identify areas of success and need and items that need development, and document performance for the personnel records. This is a wonderful chart, and it's in your book, how you align performance management to your organizational strategies. So you've got to come up with your organizational strategies. Then it's the performance management process. And then, of course, you have your employees' performance, the performance management outcomes, and then the organizational results, which we will dive into more. All right, global cultural differences in performance management. It's very interesting is that several countries have different types of performance management. It's not uncommon for managers to rate employees or to give direct feedback. Younger subordinates do not engage in joint discussion with their managers. That is definitely some of our Asian countries. Criticisms from supervisors is viewed as a personally devastating rather than useful feedback, and that's based on their cultural norms. Components of performance-focused culture. So it's important that we understand that companies who are really performance-focused drive that kind of culture, and it's really called a performance-driven organization. And many companies are very proud of that. I've used Southwest as an example. They're performance driven. It just depends on what the company is particularly interested in. So here you've got the clear expectations, goals, and definition. Detailed appraisal of the employee performance is necessary. Clear feedback on performance. Manager and employee training as needed, consequences for performance. Now, this is a traditional system. The performance management system has been around for years, and there of late has been companies who have gone away from performance management. Places like Adobe, Google, they have gotten rid of Zappos. They've gotten rid of their performance management process and replaced it with what we would call check-ins or crowdsourcing performance. So there's a lot of dialogue around whether This performance management system as it's designed now is going to be able to be useful in the 21st century with all the different generational expectations and cultural expectations. So, as you're reading this chapter and as you're thinking about performance management in your companies, just realize that there is a lot going on in this space and a lot of research regarding our traditional ways of conducting the performance management systems. So, how do we identify and measure employee performance? Well, we're identifying and measuring employee performance by the quantity of output, quality of output, timeliness of the output, efficiency of the work, presence, attendance on the job, and effectiveness of the work completed. Identifying and measuring employee performance. Well, you've got to really start with what's the job duties. And those job duties are important elements in a given job as identified from job descriptions. What an organization pays an employee to do. And then you've got to determine the weights. And what I mean by that is weights of management, of duties for the job used to show relative importance of the different duties on one job. Types of performance information. This is very good chart because it shows the difference between the 3 types of performance information you can get. The less useful, according to your book, is trait-based information, the attitude, teamwork, initiative, creativity, value, disposition. In the middle is behavior-based information, customer satisfaction, verbal persuasion, timeliness of response, citizenship ethics, effective communication. And then results-based, which is more useful, sales volume, cost reduction, units produced, improved quality. Now, there's been a lot of dialogue around this chart because it is believed that the results is more useful, but really some of the trait-based information and behavior-based information is really, really critical in companies to drive those results, and therefore they become just as important, although they're hard to measure. Where on the results-based information, it is extremely easy to get that kind of data as opposed to measuring an employee on attitude and teamwork. Performance standards. You've defined the expected levels of employee performance. Should be realistic, measurable, and clearly understood. And it benefits both the employee and the management or the organization. Ensure that everybody is involved, who is involved, knows the levels of accomplishments expected and can be both numerical and non-numerical. And that's what I talked about, some of the subjective kinds of things such as teamwork, communications. The numerical would be the sales numbers or the output numbers. And assessing non-numerical standards can be difficult, as I stated. So this is a terrific chart of what is performance standards for speaking proficiency. And it's in your book, but it's terrific because this shows anchors: superior, what is superior, participated fully in conversations relating to the need and professional interest, discussed topics both concretely and abstractly, and can deal effectively with unfamiliar speaking situations. And you can have performance level of superior, intermediate, and novice. That really gives the employee a sense of how they're being calibrated within the standards. And so it's really, these anchors are important as you start defining what proficiency looks like. Difficulties in measuring service performance. Services are individualized for the customer. Great variation in the services that can be offered. Perception of the quality is subjective, and that is a huge challenge for all of us in the performance management process, is the perceptions. Difficulty in measuring service performance. Common sources of performance differences. This is also highlighted in detail in your book, but it's regional labor cost differences, service agreement differences, equipment, infrastructure differences, and then the work volume. All right, performance appraisals. What do they do? They assess an employee's performance. They provide a platform for feedback. They help administer wages and salaries, and they help identify individual employee strengths and weaknesses. They provide answers to work-related questions, and they help improve job performance. Now, all of these comments are stated if it's done correctly. Many individuals walking out of their performance appraisal may not see improvement on job performance, may not have identified individuals' employee strengths and weaknesses. So the challenge for all of us is to train ourselves on conducting the performance appraisals correctly with all of these bullets in mind. Performance appraisals and ethics. Performance appraisals may or may not focus on a manager's ethics in performing his or her job. Tying ethics to performance is one way to emphasize it. Codes of conduct can provide useful company guidelines on ethical behavior. Training can teach important workplace ethics. I found this interesting, that's in your book. A recent study of relationship between ethics and performance appraisals found that the amount of time spent doing performance appraisals affected the incidence of ethical issues in the process. More time spent means a greater likelihood that ethical issues would be discussed. Managers doing performance appraisals should have objectives for the evaluation and be held accountable to make sure they dedicate enough time to do the appraisals well. Training managers on performance appraisal and the ethical components of the process are most likely to be successful in improving the problems. And of course, it helps promote an ethical culture. All right, the uses. There's two uses, and you can have a combination of both of these. Administrative actions for the appraisals, data used from them, and developmental actions. Administrative actions could be dismissal from work, disciplinary procedures, compensation adjustments, promotions, demotions, and transfers. So we can use all of those for the performance appraisal ratings and the contents of them for administrative actions. And then there is the developmental actions. Career progression, training opportunities, coaching, mentoring, identifying strengths and weaknesses. Now, some companies say they use both. that the performance appraisal is used for administrative actions and development actions. And that is terrific if it is used for both. Decisions about the performance appraisal process. So, designing performance appraisal systems, you need to understand appraisal responsibilities, informal versus systematic processes, and timing. So the detail of those are in your book, but really who's responsible, who's the responsibility for the formal appraisal? Is it managers? Is it both? And then is it going to be a formal process? Is it going to be informal? Is it going to be two-way? Is it going to be day-to-day? And then is systematic appraisal? Will it be more formal? Will it be, documented on a regular basis? And then the timing, is there one every 60, 90 days when the new hire comes, and then 6 months, and then annually? All of those decisions have to be made when you're developing the performance appraisal process. Now, this is the typical division of HR responsibilities in the performance appraisal. You have the HR unit, that's our function as HR practitioners. Design and maintain the appraisal system, train raters, track timely receipt of appraisals, review completed appraisals for consistency. And the manager's responsibilities are typically to rate the employee's performance, prepare formal appraisal documents, review appraisal with employees, and identify the development areas that they need to work on. So, who conducts the appraisal? Well, it can be many of these people, one of these, a supervisor rating their employees, and many companies just have that. But more and more companies are going to multi-source or 360 feedback, multi-source being a kind of crowdsourcing of performance. Employees can rate their supervisors, which I particularly love. That gives the supervisors a good sense of responsibility and feedback from their employees. Team members can rate each other if there is team-based performance. Employees rating themselves, that's the self-rating, self-evaluation. And then outside sources rating employees. That can be your customers or your interaction with individuals, your vendors, those kinds of individuals. And your book goes into quite a lot of detail about each one of these. So the multi-source appraisal is terrific because I think it gives a well-rounded feedback to the employee. Many employees will discount their feedback from their manager, maybe because they don't respect them, maybe because they're not particularly a good manager, and therefore when the employee gets some feedback, they may discount it. But the benefit of a multi-source appraisal is that the manager, customers, self, subordinates, co-workers can all provide feedback to the employee. And so if they say, hey, Diane, you have a problem, if my manager says, Diane, you have a problem with communication, you take over the conversation, you control the conversation, it's your way or the highway. If I'm getting that from a manager who I may not respect or may not particularly value their feedback, I may discount that. But if I get the feedback from everybody else, that same feedback, then that tells me there's a theme. And that theme is something that is a weakness of mine and that I need to really think about and ponder and make sure I get better at it. So that's the benefit of multi-source appraisals. And more companies are using this so that it's just not the manager appraising the employee. All right, category scale methods. You've got the graphic scale, and those are usually your descriptives. People like our 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of categories. And this is the category scaling methods. So you've got descriptive categories, you've got job duties, you've got behavioral dimensions. So when I talked about the graphic rating scale, that's your typical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And then you've got the behavioral anchored rating. Those are, and they call them anchored or measured against a scale of performance. So it kind of gives the employee a sense of what's important factors. So we call it BARS system, identifying important dimensions, which are the most important performance factors in the job description. Short statements describe both desirable and undesirable anchors. These are then translated and assigned to one of the dimensions. So it's really terrific. I particularly love behavioral dimension and behavioral rating scales. Here's concerns with the graphic rating, and that is basically your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, outstanding, meets standards, those kinds of things. There's restrictions on the range and the type of rater responses, differences in rater interpretations of the scale. I mean, we're all different raters, right? Just like you're going through this class, you may think you're a B or an A student, and maybe I think you're, a C student. Everybody has a different interpretation of scale and meaning ranges. Rating from deficiency limits, effectiveness of the appraisal. So the rating form can really impact it. And then poorly designed scales that encourage rater errors. This is the sample terms for defining the standards, and we've seen all of these. These are pretty standard. Now, the category scale method is the behavioral anchor rating. And this, I think, helps the employee and the manager really understand the category scales. It identifying important job dimensions, write short statements of job behaviors, assign statement anchors to job dimensions, and set scales for the anchors. This is an example of a behaviorally anchored rating scale for customer service. So a 5, you still have the numbers, but it gives details of used positive phrases to explain the product, offer additional pertinent information when asked questions by customers. So it's directly related to customer service skills, as opposed to, as I go back here, just outstanding, exceeds, meets, below. It really defines what it takes to get a 5 and a 4 or a 3. So I find that employees love the behavioral anchored rating scale, but it does take a lot of time to develop. Now there's comparative methods, which is ranking. It's listing all employees from highest to lowest performance. Ranking can have its challenges. It does not show size of differences in performance between employees. It implies the lowest ranked employees are unsatisfactory performers and becomes an unwielding process as the group is too large to rank. smaller companies tend to use the ranking system. And then you have force distribution, which is really forcing a distribution along a bell curve. The advantages and disadvantages are pretty interesting. You know, Jack Welch made this very popular back in the 80s and 90s because he used a forced distribution, which was eliminating the bottom 10% of performance in the organization every year. The advantages helps deal with rate or inflation, makes managers identify high, average, and low performers. It ensures the compensation increases reflect performance differences among individuals. The disadvantages are managers resist placing people in the lowest and highest groups. Explanation of placement can be difficult. Performance may not follow normal distribution. Managers may make false distinctions between the employees. So again, this is sometimes used in organizations. I think now instead of forced distribution, we use it as a guideline, the bell curve. We don't take the GE method and force rank into these structures. It creates a lot of discontent in the organization, and firms have been involved in lawsuits because of the forced distribution performance appraisal process. Here is the bell curve. Obviously 10% on each side, 20% on each side, and then 40 in the middle. Now, narrative. Narrative methods are really terrific. Again, very time consuming, but manager keeps a written record of a highly favorable or unfavorable actions. The drawbacks is variation on how the managers define a critical incident, time involved in documenting employee actions, and then most employee actions are not observed and may become different if observed. So many of this is done in the hospitals, particularly around the OR, emergency rooms, those kind of things, how individuals react. Employee concerns about managers, you know, little black books. So that's the downside. Narrative methods can be an essay. Manager writes a short essay describing an employee's performance. The drawback depends on the supervisor's writing skills and their ability to express themselves. And more people, I think, are getting away from the narratives because it's just so time consuming. All right, management by objectives. This was very, very hot in the 1980s, but I think coming back. Performance appraisal method that specifies the performance goals that an individual and manager identify together. So, and we call them MBOs. Each manager sets objectives derived from the overall goals and objectives of the organization. However, MBO should not be a disguised means for a supervisor to dictate those objectives to the employee. Other names for MBO is appraisal by results, target, coaching, work planning and review, performance objective setting, and mutual goal setting. Again, the key here is that it is done together with your manager, that the employee and the supervisor review the job description and determine the key activities that constitutes the employee job. They develop the performance standards together and what is satisfactory level. You know, for example, a quota that they may have to hit. Setting objectives together, the employee and supervisor establish the objectives. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's for that particular employee. And then continuing performance discussion. I think what has happened in the past 20 years is that performance appraisals and the performance management process has been a one-size-fits-all kind of process. And I see more and more that the MBO process is coming back. And that is because it is by employee. As we've shrunk our jobs, as we've flattened our organizations, as we've broadened our positions, you know, an employee does a multiple job practically, some doing 2 jobs in one, and so job descriptions have become larger, and so this is really, I think, something that will come back pretty aggressively in the 21st century. And then you can combine methods. No single appraisal method is best for all situations. Performance management system that uses a combination of methods may be sensible. And managers can choose a mix of methods to accomplish what they want in the performance appraisal system. Now, training of employees and managers. I think what we forget to do is we forget to train our employees. What kind of questions should you ask? What kind of expectations should you have in the appraisal? What kinds of things should your manager go over? It kind of allows the employee to take charge of their own performance and the appraisal, as well as the process, and have certain expectations from their manager. And then training the manager on, you know, the performance appraisal process and the timing and the criteria and how to give positive and constructive feedback, common errors, compensation reviews, and training and development goals. I mean, all of that is very, very important. Now, here's typical types of rating errors. There's varying standards. There's the recency. And varying standards is that you know, when appraising employees, a manager should avoid applying different standards and expectations to the employees. Recency is obviously what it says, when a rater gives greater weight to recent events. The primacy effect, which occurs when the rater gives greater weight to information received first when appraising the individual's performance. Central tendency really is really you know, everybody is either given an average performance. Appraisers who rate all employees within a narrow range in the middle commit central tendency. And the leniency error occurs when ratings of all employees fall at the high end, and the strictness error occurs when the manager uses only the lowest part of the scales for their employees. Rater bias, that's when raters' values and prejudices distort the rating. And that can be based on race, religion, seniority, sex, it just depends. The halo and horn. Halo occurs when the rater scores an employee high on all job criteria because of the performance in one area. So if they're an excellent, have excellent attendance, but they don't really have a quality of output, then that could be considered a halo effect if the manager just says, well, he's great, he comes to work every day, so I'm going to give him that halo effect. The horn effect occurs when a low rating on one characteristic leads to the overflow of an overall rating. A contrast error, that is a big one, I think, for most of us, is that we have a tendency to rate people relative to one another. rather than the performance standards. So you're always looking at, well, look at Diane, she's a good performer and Susie's not, so, you know, Susie doesn't compare to Diane, those kinds of things. And I think we all have one of these or a lot of these rating errors, rater errors, that we just need to be cognizant of. Similar to me and different to me, raters are influenced by whether people show characteristics that are the same or different from their own. So for example, you know, if you go to UT or you've gone to UT or UCLA, I might say, oh, you're similar to me, so you must be a great performer. And then different to me, oh gosh, if you went to USC, you've got to be a not so good performer. So that's the kind of error they're talking about. Okay, now this is appraisal interview hints for appraisers. I love to use this chart when I am training managers in conducting performance reviews. What you should do is on the left, obviously prepare, focus on the objective performance, be specific about the ratings, develop future improvement plans, and reinforce employee successes. And of course, do not talk too much, berate or lecture the employee, focus entirely on the negative job performance. Think that the employee always has to agree and compare the employees with others. And I know many of us get into that discussion, and so we have to focus the employee back on their performance. All right, so effective performance management. This is all of the elements of effective performance management, and we talked about this throughout this chapter. Consistent with the strategic mission, it should be a beneficial as a development tool. It should be useful as an administrative tool. Is it legal and job related? Is it viewed as fair by employees? And is the effective document, does it effectively document the employee's performance? Well, I hope you've enjoyed this webinar and found it useful. Again, thank you for attending, and if you have any questions, please email me.